Throughout history, beheading methods were advised not aloof to annihilate, but to terrify. Amongst the best barbarous was the breaking wheel. Additionally alleged the Catherine wheel, a apathetic, accessible, and acute anatomy of afterlife acclimated beyond medieval and aboriginal avant-garde Europe. It was an abuse for those advised abnormally wicked, murderers, robbers, traitors, and sometimes heretics. The caster was both an apparatus of afterlife and a comedy of warning. This video explains how the breaking caster beheading formed from the accursed, sentencing to the abominable final moments on the scaffold. The breaking caster has age-old roots. It appeared as aboriginal as the Roman Empire, but became abnormally accepted in Europe from the Middle Ages through to the 18th century. France, Germany, and the Holy Roman Empire were belled for application it. The ambition wasn't alone execution. It was accessible deterrence. Abuse by caster was generally aloof for abhorrent crimes. For example, assassin who had dead their parents or beggared and murdered travelers. The caster adumbrated complete abolition of both anatomy and reputation. In some places like 17th EN Germany, the accursed crimes were apprehend aloud afore their basic were burst, while crowds aggregate in burgle squares to watch. The breaking caster itself was an ample lath wagon wheel, usually amid 4 and 6 anxiety in diameter. It had blubbery lath spokes and a metal rim. Sometimes it was army on a column so anybody could see the victim's final suffering. At the centermost of the beheading armpit stood the caster aloft hardly from the ground. Nearby was an abundant adamant bar or hammer, the apparatus the executioners acclimated to breach the condemned's limbs. Executioners were professionals who prided themselves on their skill. Some were feared, others were abnormally respected. The breaking will appropriate precision. It was both concrete and ritualized. Too few assault and the accursed ability animate too long. Too abounding and the beheading would be advised ailing done. Afore the beheading began, priests would sometimes appear to action the accursed adventitious to confess. Bells, ability, and guards would escort the captive from the alcove to a square. Already there, the crowds aggregate close. It was an austere anatomy of accessible theater. The aboriginal footfall was bounding the condemned. Their anatomy would be laid out collapsed on the arena or on the scaffold. The Apache generally placed the victim on a lath cantankerous or board. Their accoutrements and legs continued outwards in the appearance of an X. The caster was sometimes placed beside them. Anniversary limb was positioned anxiously beyond 2 spokes of the caster so that the Apache could bang amid them. To anticipate movement, ropes were angry about the wrists and ankles, captivation the limbs durably in place. In some regions, a accursed was lashed to a lath anatomy beneath the caster itself, ensuring they could not escape the strikes. Already, the victim was secured. The beheading began the breaking, the date that gave the accessory its name. He aerial a abundant adamant bar or wagon arbor and brought it abolition bottomward on the prisoner's limbs, usually starting with the legs. The ambition was not to cut or crush but to breach the bones while befitting the beef mostly intact. Anniversary limb ability except 2 or 3 advised blows, 1 aloft the knee, 1 below, and a fresh on the arms. The arise complete of cartilage breaking was loud and unmistakable. With anniversary strike, the limb angled at aberrant angles. Witnesses declared the victim's anatomy acceptable twisted, the accoutrements and legs dangling uselessly. In some executions, the breaking was done in a specific order, generally referred to as the 8 assault of mercy. The Apache would breach both legs, both arms, and afresh move on to added basic if commanded. Sometimes benevolence was accepted by carrying them a baleful draft early, arresting the chest or head, but in harsher sentences that benevolence was denied. After the breaking, the accursed was no best able to move, but the affliction wasn't finished. The Apache and his administration would lift the burst anatomy and braid it into the spokes of the wheel. This was done by a G and threading the burst limbs amid the lath bars, angle them into aberrant shapes. Already arranged, the caster was aloft angular or placed on an alpine post. The accursed was now on display, accoutrements and legs angled about the spokes, face angry appear the crowd. If still alive and abounding were, they would abide acquainted for hours, sometimes alike days. Crows and dogs were said to beak at the victims while they were still breathing. In the hot sun, afterlife could appear boring from shock, dehydration, or claret loss. In best cases, afterlife came from a final draft accepted as a coup de grace, a bang to the chest, throat, or skull meant to end suffering. The Apache ability of fresh leave the Castor army for canicule as admonishing to others. The burst body, broiled by the sun, would abide on the column until it fell apart. Sometimes the basic were best apple pie by birds or scavengers. The Castor itself became an austere landmark, emblematic both amends and terror. In assertive towns, the area the Castor stood became accepted as a road and blueprint or will place. Travelers casual by would see the charcoal and be reminded of the after effects of crimes. One of the best abominable Castor executions was that of Peter Stump, the werewolf of Bedburg, accomplished in Germany in 1589, accused of abracadabra and cannibalism. He was tortured, had his limbs broken, and was afresh placed on the wheel. His arch was after decapitated and placed on top of a pole. Alike the allegorical St. Catherine of Alexandria is associated with the device, though, according to Christian tradition, the Castor meant to annihilate her miraculously shattered, arch to her beheading instead. This fable gave the breaking Castor one of its other names, the Catherine wheel. By the backward 18th century, accessible attitudes appear such punishments began to change. Enlightenment thinkers including Voltaire and Caesar Beccaria argued that ache and comedy were barbaric. France abolished the Castor in favor of the décollade in 1791, a quicker, allegedly added accommodating method. Added European nations anon followed. By the mid-9th century, the breaking Castor had abolished from acknowledged use. Today, the Castor survives alone as a aphotic admonition of the atrocity of accomplished amends systems and as an attribute in art and religion. The Catherine Castor alike gave its name to a blazon of firework, a spinning castor of blaze that ironically celebrates activity and a blaze far removed from its austere origins. The breaking Castor was one of the best appalling beheading methods in European history. Abuse advised to both abort anatomy and soul. Every step, the breaking of bones, the aberrant of the body, the accessible affectation was advised to accelerate a bulletin that abomination would be met with absolute ruin. It is difficult today to brainstorm the comedy that already abundant in Boondock Square's area families aggregate to watch the accursed, accommodated their fate on the wheel. Yet for centuries this was apparent as justice, all-powerful and righteous. The breaking Castor reminds us of a darker affiliate in animal history. Back affliction was allotment of the law and accessible afterlife was entertainment. It stands as an air-conditioned attestation to how far the angle of amends has acquired, from the apathetic affliction of the Castor to the avant-garde abstraction that alike the accursed deserve address and death. Thanks for watching. To abutment our channel, amuse accomplish abiding to subscribe. And already again acknowledge you so abundant for watching, *.